What? Oh, look who's there. I see some inspectors on the way. They don't want to be filmed, so please shut that thing down, would you?
From dealing with water license issues to watching his rivals pull ahead with better gear, this is how Tony Beets found himself at the mercy of the U.S. government, while Parker Schnabel came out on top. Searching for gold in the Klondike is no walk in the park, especially when it feels like everything is working against you. Just look at Tony Beets, who had to stand by as his once mighty gold mining empire started slipping through his fingers. Inspectors were threatening to shut down his operation at the Indian River claim, all because his equipment and wash plants were outdated. Just when he thought he was about to have the season of his life, everything started unraveling. Now, Tony's left wondering if he'll ever see that golden payday again. What made it worse? Watching Parker Schnabel, his younger, sharp competitor, possibly having the best season of his career. Could this really be the fall of the so-called king of the Klondike? As Tony navigated one problem after another, it became clear this season might end in disaster. Trouble started when inspectors suddenly showed up at the Indian River claim with plans to shut everything down. After they left, Tony admitted he'd missed something in the water license. Apparently, with a Class 3 license, he was only allowed to strip a very small area of land. That meant his massive mining plans had to be scaled way back. Tony had set out to mine about 15 acres, but now he wasn't even sure if they'd be able to mine one. It was a major blow, and the frustration was visible across his entire crew. Spirits dropped fast, and just when things couldn't get any worse, news hit that Parker, Tony's ambitious rival, was making impressive progress. With Parker's smart planning and newer methods, success seemed inevitable for his crew. It was a sharp contrast to Tony's old-school approach, and the results were starting to show. As if that wasn't enough, the Indian River claim started to flood. Suddenly, the crew had to put everything on hold to pump the water out. They were already behind, and now the delay threatened the whole operation. Tony knew it. Without the license, this season was going straight down the drain. To make things worse, they had to rewrite and resubmit a ton of paperwork just to try and keep things afloat. And on top of all that, Tony's biggest wash plant needed major repairs. It was just one thing after another, and each issue brought more stress and frustration. It's no surprise his entire team was feeling the weight of the setbacks. They were dealing with setback after setback. But at the end of the day, they knew they couldn't just sit around. It was time to get to work. Progress was slow, but eventually the wash plant roared back to life. For a brief moment, it felt like things were finally moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, that feeling didn't last long. Just as they were tackling yet another issue with their setup, they were hit with a major blow. The inspectors returned, delivering a harsh message. Without the proper water license, they had no choice but to shut things down again. That news crushed the team's already low morale. Despite all their effort, despite how hard they'd worked, it looked like they might never see the rewards of their labor. Faced with a tough decision, they figured their only real option was to return to Paradise Hill. That alone was a tough pill to swallow. The site had been inactive for a long time, and getting it back up and running was no easy task. It was going to take everything they had, not just to mine the ground, but to turn any kind of profit. Meanwhile, as they scrambled to get things moving at Paradise Hill, they couldn't help but glance over at Parker's operation. It was running like clockwork, smooth, efficient, and on track to hit record numbers. Watching that had to sting. While Parker seemed destined for one of his best seasons yet, Tony and his team were struggling just to stay afloat. But they had no choice. They had to press on. The biggest challenge they faced now was water management. Without a consistent water supply, their entire mining process was on the line. Still, they pushed forward, doing everything they could to work around the issue. The team held up under immense pressure, and stress, refusing to throw in the towel, and slowly but surely, they started seeing results. A couple 100 ounces a week wasn't the massive haul they'd hoped for, but it was something. It meant they weren't out of the game just yet. All the obstacles they faced this season had put Tony's title as the King of the Klondike under serious threat. As the saying goes, heavy is the head that wears the crown. But even in the face of so many problems, Tony and his crew didn't back down. They managed to extract some gold from the ground, not as much as they dreamed of, but each piece was a small victory. Each nugget was a reminder that they were still in the fight. It gave them a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could salvage something from this nightmare of a season. After all, if Parker could turn things around, why couldn't they? Before they knew it, the final weeks of the season were approaching. The entire year felt like a blur, a whirlwind of effort and emotion. They had poured everything into reviving the operation at Paradise Hill. It was hard, frustrating work, but they weren't ready to quit. If they wanted anything from this season, they had to dig deeper than ever before. But no matter how hard they tried, there was no turning back time. The Indian River claims weren't coming back to what they once were. The challenges were simply too great, too overwhelming, and in the end, they fell short of the grand goals they'd set at the start of the season. Despite everything, Tony and his crew kept pushing forward, facing each challenge head-on. Sure, they'd had more successful seasons in the past, but everyone in this game knows you can't win every time. King of the Klondike or not, sometimes you just have to take the hits and keep moving. And for someone like Tony Beets, a man known for taking big risks, this season was another test. He had no choice but to figure out how to overcome the mountain of problems piling up on him and his team. The move to the Indian River claim hadn't solved anything. In fact, it only exposed more cracks in their plan. Tony made a decision. Everything had to be moved to Paradise Hill. All their equipment, all their iron, nothing was staying behind. They were going to give it their all, strip as much land as they could, and hope for the best. But hope doesn't always translate into results. The land was still flooded, and the old rusting wash plant they had to work with wasn't doing them any favors. They were losing money and burning through resources at a rate that couldn't be sustained. Then there was the water license issue, a massive setback. What was supposed to be a 15-acre mining plan got slashed down to just 1 acre. That kind of limitation crushed their chances from the start. While Tony and his team were stuck fighting the elements and outdated gear, Parker and his crew were sprinting toward what looked like a record-breaking season. With advanced equipment and razor-sharp planning, Parker had created a mining operation that every other crew, including Tony's, envied. The contrast couldn't have been more glaring. While Parker's machines ran like a dream, Tony's setup clanked along, outdated and unreliable. Progress was almost non-existent. The problems at Indian River seemed endless, and their backup plan at Paradise Hill was far from smooth. The equipment there had been left unused for so long that getting it back into working condition just added more delays. It was like trying to sprint with your shoelaces tied together. Still, they refused to give up. They kept mining, hoping to pull as much gold as they could before time ran out. It wasn't nothing, but it was far from the 6,000 ounces they had set their sights on. So when the season began wrapping up, the disappointment hit hard. They had worked like madmen, but the payoff just wasn't there. Meanwhile, Parker's team was pulling gold like it was growing out of the ground. Watching that unfold must have stung. Their operation was everything Tony's wasn't: modern, well-planned, and running like a well-oiled machine. It was hard not to see Parker's success as a result of all the smart investments he'd made in new technology and strategy. And judging by the smiles and positive energy on Parker's claim, those investments were paying off big time. Even with the usual minor hiccups, Parker's setup was clean, efficient, and productive. It was working, and it was working well. Tony and his team must have felt bitter, especially as winter crept closer with each passing day. They were forced to face a hard truth. The Klondike had changed, and they hadn't kept up. The mining landscape was evolving, and while others like Parker were adapting and thriving, Tony's operation was being left behind. Watching Parker's team succeed so visibly only made it worse. It was a clear reminder that those who embraced change were the ones reaping the rewards. That kind of lesson is tough to swallow, but Tony and his crew had no choice but to accept it. Change is constant, and the Klondike was no exception. With that realization, they had to pull themselves together and prepare for whatever was coming next. Their time at the Indian River claims made one thing clear. They needed to be ready, and they needed to evolve. But as the season wound down, the challenges only mounted. Winter was coming fast, and that meant trouble for their already struggling machines. Breakdowns, malfunctions, and an aging wash plant that just couldn't keep up. It was all coming to a head. The inability to get the spare parts they needed only made things worse. And then there was the morale, completely drained. The crew was exhausted, physically and mentally, and no one knew if they'd be able to push through. Despite all of that, they kept going. They had no choice but to focus on what they could salvage at Paradise Hill. It wasn't easy. It was still an uphill battle, but the crew came together determined to get the place up and running. But even then they were mostly coming up with temporary solutions. They worked hard, really hard, and they hoped it would all be worth it in the end. Tony admitted that the delays were partly his fault. They should have started earlier, had everything ready to go, but now they were scrambling to make up for lost time. And those quick fixes, they didn't solve the deeper issues, not even close. It was a tough sight to witness, a once dominant team now just barely holding things together. The difference in leadership between the two crews was night and day. Parker's team was streamlined and forward-thinking, while Tony's crew was held back by outdated methods and a lack of adaptability. But regardless of how things looked, both teams were still grinding, still fighting to meet their targets before the season came to a close. As winter closed in, both crews went into overdrive. They grabbed whatever gold they could, knowing that every ounce counted. They also began preparing for the next season. One team, Parker's, was working to become even more efficient. The other, Tony's, was focused on making sure they didn't repeat the same mistakes. You could feel the tension in the air. Both sides knew that the real battle would come next year. This season, Parker expanded his empire, while Tony was left licking his wounds. But that doesn't mean it's over. If Tony wants to keep his crown as the king of the Klondike, he's going to have to make some serious changes. He'll need to step up, innovate, and fight like never before. Because in the wild world of gold mining, nothing is guaranteed and everyone is chasing the same dream.